Hello, and welcome back to the Cellblock Scorch. I'm Cricket, and this is week 43. The prompt this week was given by Peishi, and it was the quote, "Why wouldn't I?" And the additional details must involve a monarchy and a betrothal. Can be fandom or original. I make no apologies. Which again, what's the point of doing a weekly writing contest with your friends if you can't make them write exactly the specific thing you want to see? I was really excited about this prompt. I knew right away what I wanted to do for it because I had written a piece earlier that I always intended to be one of like a trio of pieces. So I was like, this is the perfect opportunity to continue in that world. So I'm just going to jump right into the tale of all fur. The queen smiled as she walked into the children's playroom, pausing to watch them for a few moments. Donovan and Lillian were building some complicated system with stacks of blocks, and Laurent was curled up in an armchair reading. It wasn't often that she was able to just watch them, so she was content to stand in the doorway, unnoticed. That is, until Donovan snatched a block that Lillian had been reaching for, causing her to shout and tackle him, effectively knocking over their whole creation. The queen knew a storm was coming as clouds darkened Donovan's eyes, and she stepped forward them to speak. "Hello, my darlings." Donovan looked up, and a smile chased the clouds away from his expression. "Stepmother!" He and Lillian jumped up and ran over to give her a hug, while Laurent looked up from his book and gave a small wave. "Won't you tell us a story?" Lillian was looking up imploringly as she held onto her skirts, and the queen laughed. "Yes, please!" Both her older brothers joined in. "Now why wouldn't I? But let's see about rebuilding your city while we're at it, She walked over and sat down by the mess of blocks and began to write them again. Donovan and Lillian followed, settling in to help. Laurent put his book down but remained in the chair by the window. "Well, Laurent," the queen asked, looking at the older boy, "what shall we have in the story tonight?" He looked up, tapping his chin thoughtfully, then said, "Thieves and robbers!" The queen nodded, Lillian gasped, and Donovan laughed at her. She glared at him, green eyes flashing. "And Donovan, what would you like?" He smiled shyly at his stepmother as he asked. "A ball? Can there be a ball?" "I'm sure we can manage that." "Lillian?" The little girl tilted her head as she paced her next block, asking, "Can it be about Red and her wolf?" Both her brothers nodded enthusiastically, and the queen smiled. "Thieves and robbers, a ball, and Red and her wolf? I shall tell you the tale of Allfur, the lost maiden." Now, our story takes place several years after Red had befriended Fiel, and sometime after she had saved the beast. She was grown up now, and her father had arranged a betrothal for her with a prince of a nearby kingdom. She had never met this prince in person, but they had exchanged letters, and all she knew of him was good. Red missed her mother, who had passed away some years before, but she was very happy with her father, and she was excited about the betrothal. She and the prince had been maintaining correspondence for some time, and the prince had sent her several small tokens, a miniature golden spinning wheel, a beautiful golden spool, and a ring, which was to be her wedding ring. The time came that she was to make a journey to the other kingdom to meet the prince, and the wedding was to be soon after. She asked her father for a few gifts in preparation for this journey and to celebrate the wedding. 3 dresses, fashioned as the sun, the moon, and the stars, and a fur cloak made in pieces from all the 1,000 animals of the forest around their home. These he prepared gladly, and finally she was ready for her journey. The night before she was to depart, disaster struck. A band of marauders, having heard of the wealth this family possessed, broke into the house. However, they were displeased with the spoils they found, and this put them into a foul mood. Red's father awoke, and when he went to see what was happening, the robbers stabbed him in the heart. She too had awoken and was watching from around a corner. There were too many of them for her to combat, expert with knife-throwing though she was. So she crept back into her bedroom, gathering the gifts her father had given her. The 3 fantastical dresses she kept in a walnut shell. She draped herself in the beautiful piecework fur coat, tucking the walnut shell and the 3 gifts from her betrothed into her pocket. She climbed out the window, calling for Fiel, who came to her through the night. Fiel was an old wolf by now, but still strong and loyal as ever. However, the marauders saw her before she could escape, and, determining that she must be leaving with something of great value, they chased after her. Red and Fiel ran into the forest, Red trusting in the guidance of her wolf and her knowledge of the forest to outpace the thieves who were chasing her. She didn't really have time to plan, but she was sure that if she could make it to the castle of her betrothed, all would be well. At one point the men almost caught them. Fiel stopped, a low growl sounding in his throat, and she knew, with the certainty that comes from years of companionship, that she was to keep running. Fiel would catch up. Eventually she made it into unfamiliar forest, but still she ran, heedless of the dangers. Her foot caught on something in the dark, and she fell, silent as the night around her. The next morning, a troop of men, led by their prince, were riding through their forest on a hunt. They came across a very peculiar animal, with such a pelt as they had never before witnessed, and the prince called that they ought to tie it to the back of the wagon and take it with them. As the men approached, they realized that what they saw was no animal, but a maiden in a peculiar fur cloak. She did not stir as they picked her up and put her in the wagon. The prince was moved with compassion and determined to discover what had befallen her and help her in any way they could. By and by, they came to the palace, and she woke up. However, when questioned on who she was and how she came to be in the forest, she could give no answer. The king, at behest of the prince, decided to take mercy on her and offered her a position in the kitchen, which she gratefully accepted. All-fur is what the cook called her, and she was a good worker, helping in the kitchen. Sometimes she was called to help the king, the father of her betrothed, prepare for bed. She would pull off his boots, and because he was not a nice man, he would always throw a boot at her head. All-fur began to believe that was all she was good for. Now she began to hear whispers in the palace of the prince's betrothed who had gone missing. Their home had been ransacked, the maiden's father killed, and there was no sign of her. How sad it made her to imagine the girl's fate. There was talk, too, of her magnificent silver wolf who had been seen roaming the forests. All-fur began to have some recollection of her life before. A beautiful manor home, loving parents, a dear friend she had made. But no names, nothing specific to grasp onto. She discovered a knack for knife throwing, a skill which was much appreciated, and she was sometimes allowed into the forest to hunt small game. On one such trip she was approached by an old silver wolf who she regarded only with curiosity. He nuzzled her hand with his head, whining affectionately, and she knew his name was Fiel. In that moment of clarity, All-fur realized her true identity, but she knew not what to do, for in the castle of her betrothed, they all regarded her as the scullery maid All-fur. She could not simply claim her position. Still, Fiel would not leave her side, and she returned to the castle with her wolf. The cook was very surprised, but allowed her to keep him in her little room as long as he made no trouble. This she did, often taking him out to the forest with her so he could run. Now a day came when it was announced that the prince would be holding a ball, and All-fur began to fashion a plan that would allow her to speak to her betrothed. On the night of the ball she asked the cook if she could be excused to go upstairs and watch the festivities. Yes, said the cook, for he was an understanding man, and All-fur was a very hard worker. But only for half an hour. So All-fur hurried into her little room and cleaned all the dirt off herself. She set aside her fur cloak, taking out the walnut shell, and unfurling the beautiful golden dress her father had given her. So she entered the ball, and when people saw her shining like the sun, they assumed she was some unknown princess. The prince thought she was very lovely and asked her to dance, and she willingly obliged. They passed a wonderful time together, and as they talked, the prince found himself thinking, "Something in the way she speaks reminds me of the letters from my dear fiancé." But as soon as the dance was over, she disappeared, and no one knew who she was. All-fur had run back down to her room, where she covered herself in soot and once again dressed in her fur cloak. Upon her return to the kitchen, the cook told her to make a soup for the prince, but to be very careful not to let any hairs fall into it. This All-fur did, but she slipped the ring that the prince had given her into the soup. Now when the prince ate the soup, he found it delicious. He discovered the ring, which seemed to him to be precisely like the ring he had given his fiancée. So he called for the cook, who scolded All-fur, sure that she had gotten hair in the soup. However, when the cook greeted the prince, he said that the soup was very good, and that he wished to speak to the person who had prepared it. So All-fur was sent for, and when she stood in front of the prince, he asked, "Who are you, and what are you doing in my castle? Where did you get the ring that was in this soup?" But she only replied, "I'm nothing but a girl whose mother and father are dead. I am nothing and am good for nothing except for having boots thrown at my head. I also know nothing about the ring." After she said that, she ran away. Of course, this was untrue, but Alfur knew that it was too early yet to reveal herself, so she waited. Some time later, the prince was holding another ball. Again, Alfur requested of the cook that she be allowed to go upstairs and watch for just a little while. Again, the cook said she could go for half an hour. So Alfur ran to her little room and put on her silver dress that sparkled like the moon, and hurried to the ball. The dancing had already begun, but when the prince saw the mysterious maiden again, he asked her to dance with him again. They had a lively conversation, and the prince became more convinced that she was his fiancée, for she seemed so like her. But when the ball ended, she had vanished, and the prince was left with no clues as to her identity. She was once again all fur, down in the kitchen, hands and face black with soot, preparing soup for the prince. This time she slipped the little golden spinning wheel into his soup. The prince saw the wheel and was yet more amazed, for he knew that it was the same he had sent to his fiancée. Again the cook and Alfur were summoned, and again they claimed to know nothing. Now the prince decided to hold a third ball, hoping that his beloved would once again return, and fixing a plan to hold on to her. On the eve of the ball, Alfur asked again to go watch, but the cook was annoyed with her and wanted to tell her no. He thought she was a witch, enchanting the soup to make it taste better than his, but she pleaded with such heart that he relented, but only for half an hour. So this time she appeared at the ball in a dress that glimmered like the starlight, and the prince was sure that she was his intended. He ordered the musicians to play on so he could keep dancing with her as long as possible. And as they danced, he slipped the ring that he had found in his soup on her finger. However, even the prince couldn't keep hold of her forever, and she slipped away yet again. Alfur ran back to her room, where she put the fur cloak back on over her dress, since she was late and didn't have time to change. The cook was quite cross, but still Alfur was allowed to make the soup. This time she slipped in the golden spool, and when the prince found it, he was quite convinced that his bride was nearby, for any other solution seemed to him impossible. He ran down to the kitchens himself, demanding to know who had made the soup. Again he found Alfur. This time, however, she told the prince that she did know of the trinkets he had been finding in his soup, and that she was indeed his betrothed. Hardly daring to believe it for the joy he felt, he asked her to prove it. She removed the fur cloak and called Fiel to her side, standing proud in the middle of the kitchen with her green eyes flashing. Then she explained the misfortune that had befallen her. The prince was overjoyed, and soon thereafter the two were wed. "Oh, stepmother, that was lovely!" Lillian was the first to break the spell the words left lingering in the air. "Were they happy, stepmother? Were they in love?" Donovan asked, with a serious look on his face, as he placed one last block on a tower. "Oh, yes, darling," the queen smiled at him. "They loved each other very much." "What happened to them?" Larned asked, eyes alight with curiosity. "Well, they had 3 children, who they loved even more than they ever thought possible, and they lived very happily all together." The queen smiled at the children, and they grinned back at her, green eyes shining with joy. "Now I think that's enough for tonight. You should be getting to bed, Lillian pouted and flung herself onto her stepmother in a hug. Donovan and Laurent followed soon after, and the queen held them close as they all laughed together.
What's up, inmates? This is Pacey with some judge comments. You all just listened to Cricket's Scorch. I have just reread all 3 of the Scorches that I received for this prompt, and I absolutely loved Crickets. I hope you all enjoyed it too. I picked it because it was fun. I love the dynamic of a story told within a story. I think that's always nice. And there's a lot of Grimm fairy tale references. I think I've mentioned before that one of the only books I actually own is a copy of a collection of all the Grimm fairy tales, and I love them, so I was very excited about this submission. Grishmak and Lost also wrote Great Embers that you can check out on the Patreon. Grishmak's in particular, I will say, I, as a rule, dislike the trope of a princess shunning her duty to marry a betrothed for the duty of the kingdom, whatever. I don't like that trope in general, which, as I say this, I realize it is a hilarious opinion to take, because for this NaNoWriMo, the novel I am currently writing, almost all of the conflict actually stems from a princess refusing to marry her betrothed. And I support her, and I love her. Anyway, in general, hate that trope, but it was interesting nonetheless, and lots of people like that trope, and so would enjoy that Ember. I think that's all the commentary I have for you. Please keep those fires burning.
So that was the final piece of my Queen the Storyteller triptych, which isn't finished. The first piece you heard in week 23 of this podcast. I wrote it literally 6 years ago. Almost 7 years ago. And the second piece that I wrote is this one right here, which is actually the final one. The middle piece is Beauty and the Beast retelling that I haven't written yet. Even though it's been kicking around in my head for literally 6 years. It's fine. I love these characters. I love this little fairy tale. I was really excited to have this opportunity to revisit them in this little world again. This fairy tale, you may notice, seems kind of similar to Cinderella, but it is, in fact, a fairy tale called The Tale of Allfur. I have a complete collection of Grimm's fairy tales, and it's so fun to just read them all. And a lot of them are similar, but all the little details are fun and so different. And I loved this one, and The Tale of Allfur, and it fit really well for what I wanted. I loved the drama in it and the mystery. It is also hilarious to me that Allfur creates choking hazard soups for her fiancé, but it's okay. They all end up happy in the end. I do keep killing off her family members in really traumatic ways, though, and I am sorry about that. Poor Red. But yeah, this is just, it's a fun little world to revisit. I love fairy tales and fairy tale retellings, and the Grimm fairy tales are so interesting. You know, they didn't write them, they collected them. And a lot of them were also collected by the wife of one of the Grimm brothers and her mother, Bettina and Gisela von Arnim, did a ton of the work in collecting and assembling the fairy tales, and they wrote some of their own as well. I don't know if I said this before, but I majored in German literature and culture in college, so if you want to know more about Bettina von Arnim, please let me know. I will be so happy to tell you all about this. But yeah, I love this little world. I really need to finish my little triptych and stitch them all together. But in the meantime, the Scorch went on. Oh my gosh, here we come again. We got another new member. This is when Octo joined for week 44. So we now had a little 5-person group, which meant I got to judge 4 stories. And my prompt was dream travel with an exclamation point. So, very excited for you all to hear this upcoming piece. I really loved what I got for this week. Keep those fires burning, y'all.
The Cellblock Scorch is a production of Stellacore, an independent group of nerds sharing their obsessions with the world. We can be reached at thestellacore@gmail.com, through comments on your podcast platform of choice, our Instagram, Stella_core, and at our YouTube, also called Stellacore. Follow Cellblock Scorch Podcast on Instagram, or the Cellblock Scorch on Tumblr to see the prompt the day before the episode drops and a quote from each Scorch the day after, with flavor commentary from Red, our social media manager. Feel free to check out our other productions on our YouTube channel or our cosplays on Instagram. If you would like to support our creative endeavors, you can give a one-time tip to the Ko-Fi of the writer of your favorite Scorches, or check out our Patreon, linked in the show notes. There, you can access the Scorches and episode transcripts for free, or sign up for Spark level support for $5 a month to gain access to our Embers as well.